Chapter 1651. She swallowed her saliva. Yi Liangxiu exclaimed softly in disbelief. Then he weighed the food in his hand and asked, "What did you feed her?" She had grown a body full of meat. Qin Anlin looked at her angrily and then pursed his lips. She can only eat some supplementary food. She can't eat these. As he spoke, he walked over, picked up little Moo Moo with one hand, and kissed him. "Is the baby hungry?" The doting look in his eyes could not be deceived. Even when he was at his best with Yi Liangxiu, he was not as affectionate as he was now. His daughter was the little girl of Papa's previous life. This was not wrong at all. Yi Liangxiu's eyes were a little hot. Now she felt that she was little Moo Moo, looking at him, the golden cake, but she could only look at it, but not eat it. Qin Anlin directed Yi Liangxiu, "Turn off the fire. You can eat it first." After that, she asked a very stupid question. "What about you?" Qin Anlin looked at her and said after a long time, "I'll feed Moo Moo first." He held little Moo Moo in one hand and opened a square bag with the other. He quickly took out a can of milk powder, brewed it, and shook it well. As soon as little Moo Moo took a bite, he was reluctant to put it down and drank it greedily. He's eating so happily. Yi Liangxiu sat at the dining table and couldn't bear to look away. She also wanted to hold little Moo Moo and eat. Just looking at him made her feel happy. However, she was still timid and didn't dare to make a request. Qin Anlin sat opposite her and looked at her. "Why aren't you eating?" She nodded and lowered her head to eat. His cooking was very good. The food was golden and crispy. Mu Yin likes to eat it very much now, and he's grown taller recently. Qin Anlin's voice was low and slow. Yi Liangxiu raised his eyes and looked at him. He smiled. "Moreover, Mu Yin sometimes goes to Tang Yu's house." After a pause, he said, "I think it's a lie. Was there such a thing?" Yi Liangxiu didn't know what to say. Although she had a good relationship with Pei Chi and would meet occasionally, she had never heard Chi talk about Mu Yun. She thought of Mu Yun's attitude toward Xiaoxin and smiled. "What are your plans?" Qin Anlin let little Mu Mu eat by himself. His gaze fell on Yi Liangxiu's face. "Are you planning for Mu Yun's future?" Yi Liangxiu looked down. "I'm just asking," Qin Anlin said in a threatening tone. "I don't believe that you can't see that Mu Yun has feelings for the little girl of Tang Yu's family. So what if he could tell?" "Anlin, Mu Yun is still young," she exclaimed softly. Qin Anlin smiled mockingly. "Is that so? Last time at Tang Yu's house, Xiaoxin threw a tantrum because she didn't want to learn anything. She was punished. Do you know what Mu Yun said when he came back?" She looked at him in surprise. Qin Anlin said slowly, "Mu Yun told me that he won't inherit King Entertainment anymore. He'll go to Boyi when he grows up." If these words were said by a child from an ordinary family, adults would think that it was very promising. However, it was said by Qin Anlin's son, so it wasn't the case. This little guy obviously had Xiaoxin in his heart, and his heart ached for her. He already knew how to love someone at such a young age, but he still pretended to be very cold. After Qin Anlin finished speaking, Yi Liangxiu was also a little surprised. Mu Yun actually had such ambition. A conversation between adults was definitely not about a child's feelings. Chapter 1652. Mu Yun liked Xiaoxin. It wasn't that he couldn't stop them from meeting, but he didn't want to. Mu Yun didn't have a mother anymore. He didn't want him to be unhappy, so he had been letting him do what he wanted. After all, the child was still young. However, one day he would grow up. What happened then? Yi Liangxiu looked down and said, "Maybe Tang Yu and Chi will have another child. If they gave birth to a boy, this problem would no longer bother them." Qin Anlin smiled and said, "That's unlikely. If they had a child, they would have done so long ago. They wouldn't have waited until now." And he couldn't see Tang Yu's attitude. His son was still young, and he didn't want to see him have a difficult love life in the future. Now Xiaoxin showed that she was afraid of Mu Yun. Mu Yun was popular, and he didn't know what would happen in the future. This was what a father was most worried about. Just like how he treated Pei Chi back then, moreover, Mu Yun and Xiaoxin were involved in interests, so it would be more complicated. Yi Liangxiu was silent for a long time. She didn't want her son to be wronged. She couldn't tell him not to like Mu Yun. Moreover, he was so young. How innocent and cute it was to like someone at such a young age. Don't force those complicated things on him and Xiaoxin. Maybe you will be more relaxed this way, and he will be more relaxed in the future, Liangxiu said lightly. She was no longer in the mood to eat. She now knew why he asked her to meet the children tonight. It was probably because he wanted to talk to her about it. But Tang Yu has asked Mu Yin to take care of Xiaoxin on Saturdays and Sundays when he doesn't go to school. Qin Anlin looked at her and said. Liangxiu was really surprised and didn't speak for a long time. Then what Tang Yu means? She wasn't sure. Qin Anlin sighed and didn't say anything more. Mu, who was in his arms, drank and was so satisfied that he fell asleep. The child is asleep. I'll take her to the room, he said softly. Liangxiu looked at his gentle manner and felt a surge of warmth in her heart. Anlin, you're a good father. He got up and paused for a moment. That's why you left safely, right? She froze for a moment, unable to answer his question. While he was sending Mu to the bedroom, she went to see Mu Yun and Momo. They were all her children, and she loved and liked them all. She walked into the room quietly and sat on the edge of the bed. To her surprise, little Mu Yun was still awake. Mom, will you be there tomorrow morning? Xiao Mu Yun moved her little head over and moved it to the side of her legs. She looked as weak as a small animal. Liangxiu reached out to touch him. No matter how fierce she was in front of Xiaoxin, he was still a child, of course. She comforted him softly. Go to sleep. She had something on her mind, but since her son didn't want to talk about it, she didn't say anything. Such a big boy always had his own thoughts, and he was also a little concerned about his reputation. Mom, little Mu Yun called her with some dependence. She nodded and lay down beside him. She slowly pulled him into her arms and kissed him. Mom wants you to be happy. Just now, she made a decision. If he liked her, she would let go. She believed that Mu Yun would get what he wanted. She never doubted his intelligence. Chapter 1653. Liangxiu hugged the little person and felt that he had grown taller and bigger. But no matter how big and tall he was still an 8 or 9-year-old child. In front of her, he would also act coquettishly. At this moment, he would even be embarrassed. Her heart softened, and she felt that she had let Mu Yun down. So why would she stop him from liking Xiaoxin? She reached out to rub the little guy's hair and kissed little Momo. After coaxing them to sleep together, she left quietly. When she returned to the bedroom, Qin Anlin and little Mu were already lying on the bed. Little Mu was asleep, but he was not. He was leaning against the bed, and when he saw her come in, he looked at her deeply. That gaze made her a little embarrassed and went to bed. She held her collar with her fingers and pursed her lips after a long while. You're not asleep yet. His gaze was still deep. He stared at her for a long time before replying, Don't worry, I don't have the energy to do anything else. He paused and said, Besides, with little Mu here, what can I do? She was relieved when he asked this. She covered her collar with her hand and carefully laid down beside him. However, she was wrong. As soon as she lay down, he pulled her over and her body touched little Mu. She was afraid of waking little Mu up, so she curled up her body, but his arm was holding hers forcefully. Liangxiu was a little angry. Qin Anlin, if you don't want to wake Mu up, come up. His tone was very calm. She couldn't believe it and suddenly looked up at him. Come up? Where is he going? He reached out and held her waist. Behind her, she knew because she was lying on top of him, and little Mu was still in his arms. Was he crazy? Qin Anlin. She cried out in surprise and was fiercely kissed by him. The kiss was lingering. She opened her eyes and could even see little Mu's sleeping face. Her heart was anxious and angry. When he left her lips, she opened her mouth and kissed his neck. She bit so hard that her teeth left a mark, and a trace of blood came out. Under the dim yellow light, his gaze was so heavy that it seemed like water was about to drip out. He reached out and caressed that place. Initially, he was just teasing her and had no intention of touching her. But now he changed his mind. Narrowing his eyes, he reached out and pulled it down. She lay in his arms, not daring to make a sound, only daring to stare at him. Qin Anlin, on the other hand, became hot again. But the result of being too emotional was that he forgot to take precautions. In the midst of his ecstasy, he seemed to be stunned for a moment. In the end, he couldn't help but hug her and enjoy the aftertaste together. After he stopped panting, he brushed aside her sweaty hair and pressed his lips against the soft flesh behind her ear. I didn't have any protection just now. Her body trembled, and she looked up at him. His eyes were clear and bright as he looked at her, but he didn't say anything. "Don't worry, I will take the medicine." Her heart was bitter, but she forced a smile. At this moment, he felt the hot sweat on his body suddenly turn cold. He felt a little uncomfortable, so he turned over and said, "I'm going to take a shower." He closed his eyes and calmed down. He didn't stop her, but he cleaned up after she left. That night, he didn't talk anymore, probably because of the unhappiness just now. However, at dawn, he still went out and bought the medicine for her. Chapter 1654. I thought you meant for me to take the medicine. You bought it too. I can't waste it, right? She took a sip of water and smiled. The veins on Cheen Anlin's forehead popped. He clenched his fists, but did not say anything in the end. It was Saturday and Christmas, so she did not object when he said that he wanted to spend Christmas with the children. However, it was not a good idea to stay in the hotel all the time. In the end, he decided to buy some materials to decorate the apartment so that the children would be happy. There were 2 adults and 3 children. Fortunately, little Mu Yin knew how to take care of his younger siblings, so it would not be so tiring. Cheen Anlin drove them to a large shopping mall to buy Christmas decorations. Momo and little Mumu were placed in a small cart and pushed by Mu Yin. Perhaps it was because they were twins. Although they had not been together for a long time, their hearts were always connected. Soon, they became intimate with each other. Their heads leaned against each other, and their bodies leaned against each other. It was obvious that they were born from the same nest. The 3 of them were all good-looking, and everyone looked at them enviously. The children looked so good. Cheen Anlin looked after the children. Yu Liangxiu was in charge of shopping, and she would occasionally ask for his opinion. He rarely spoke. At most, he would nod or shake his head. He was quite cold. However, Yu Liangxiu was very excited because she rarely had such an opportunity to spend time with the other 2 children, especially on such a holiday. She wanted to make up for it as much as possible, so she tried her best to make the children happy on this day. After shopping for about an hour, she should have bought almost everything. When she was about to leave, she met a friend of Cheen Anlin's from the shopping mall. They were not close, but not distant. They drank together, but did not talk to each other. They all knew that Cheen Anlin and his wife were separated, but they did not expect that they would go to such a place together, like an old married couple. While chatting with Cheen Anlin, she took a few more glances at Yu Liangxiu. "This is my wife, Yu Liangxiu." Cheen Anlin smiled faintly and introduced her in a calm tone. The man was taken aback, but he still reached out his hand. "Ma Qingwei, I was there when you got married." Yu Liangxiu was even more surprised than him, because Cheen Anlin really didn't need to introduce her to his friends now. However, she did not lose her composure. She gently shook his hand and let go. "Hello." Mr. Ma and Cheen Anlin talked for 5 minutes and then left. When they arrived at the apartment building, Yu Liangxiu couldn't help but ask, "Do you still want to give people the illusion that your family is harmonious? Which subsidiary of King Entertainment is going to be listed?" He bent over and moved the things out. When he looked up at her, he said coldly, "Yu Liangxiu, congratulations on becoming a qualified businesswoman. You put profit first." After being mocked by him, she didn't say anything else. He was carrying the things, and she was carrying the baby. Of course, he was also carrying a baby under his arm. When they reached the apartment together, he waited for her to come in. After kicking the door open, he put down little Moo Moo and the big box in his hand. Cheen Anlin took the child to the game room to play, while Mu Yin took care of his sister-in-law. He went to prepare the Christmas dinner. Yu Liangxiu changed into light clothes and began to check the items. In the end, she found a few boxes at the bottom of the box. They didn't look like decorations, but more like gifts. The place they went to today wouldn't have such expensive gifts. Chapter 1655. There was another box with a watch in it. She recognized it at a glance, but it was a Christmas edition. It should be custom-made. Was this for her? She squatted down and looked at it for a long time. In the end, she put the watch on her hand. It suited her very well. She looked in the direction of the kitchen and smiled lightly. Maybe he wasn't as cold as he seemed. She spent an hour and a half decorating the apartment. There were Christmas trees, little snowflakes, and twinkling little lights. The children also had their own costumes, especially little Moo and little Momo, who had their own special little cars that could slide around at home. When Cheen Amlin came out, he saw that the children were having a good time. The apartment was no longer as lifeless as the model room, but it was full of life. They chose to eat lunch in the dining room. He ordered some processed ingredients and made a feast. The children sat in a row, and she sat next to him. Looking at them like this, she felt as if this was the first time their family was sitting at the same table. Cheen Amlin looked at Yi Liangxiu. "Why aren't you eating?" However, adults really couldn't eat because the twins were young. They could only eat after they finished eating. Even if it was just a little, the two little guys had to be satisfied. So they each held one and were about to feed them when the door opened, followed by Qingxiu's voice. "Amlin," a soft cry followed. "So beautiful." Xiao Mian came with Qingxiu. It was Xiao Mian, who he said had nothing to do with. When Cheen Amlin heard the voice, he instinctively glanced at Yi Liangxiu. Her expression was very normal, and she only smiled faintly. When she smiled, he was annoyed. Then, he turned his body and looked at the two uninvited people. It was fine if it was Aunt Sue, but he remembered that Xiao Mian was not allowed to come. When Qingxiu looked at Yi Liangxiu, her eyes darkened. She didn't expect her to come back. She looked back at Xiao Mian and forced a smile. "I was afraid that you wouldn't be able to take care of the child. It's Christmas today, and the children love to be lively. I thought that Xiao Mian would be familiar with the child, so I brought her here. Since the person was already here, it wasn't good to disrespect Aunt Sue." So Cheen Amlin didn't say anything. He just looked at Yi Liangxiu and said, "Go get 2 more bowls of rice." As soon as he said that, Su Xiu and Xiao Mian's expressions changed. These words were quite subtle. It sounded like he was ordering Yi Liangxiu around, but in reality, he was highlighting Yi Liangxiu's status as the master. Especially Crispy Sleeve, her face darkened. "I'll go." Yi Liangxiu wasn't in the mood to argue with her, and continued to feed silent. At this moment, a shattering sound came from the kitchen, and Qingxiu suddenly screamed. Cheen Amlin instinctively pushed little Mumu aside, which happened to be in Xiao Mian's arms, and he went over to look at Qingxiu. When he went in, Qingxiu patted her chest and pointed at the debris on the ground. "It's okay. My hand just slipped. I'll clean it up. Young master, go out and eat." Cheen Amlin nodded. "Be careful. The floor is slippery." When he went out, he was surprised to see little Mumu lying on Xiao Mian's chest through the sweater. He was doing something that was exactly the same as when he was lying in Yi Liangxiu's arms. He was a little surprised. Xiao Mian had only been here 2 or 3 times in total, and she didn't have much contact with Mumu. Why was Mumu so close to her? He looked at Yi Liangxiu. Her face had already darkened as she looked at him. Chapter 1656. Cheen Amlin's expression didn't look good either. He didn't know why. He looked at Xiao Mian with a gloomy gaze. At this moment, Xiao Mian seemed to be a little shocked and said in a weak voice, "Mumu, I'm not your mother." Little Mumu was still scratching with a yearning look on his little face. Yi Liangxiu calmed down. It seemed that even if Cheen Amlin didn't mean it, some people still wanted to stick to him. She took little Mumu from him indifferently. When little Mumu saw her, he immediately changed sides. He buried his little face in her arms and began to cry through her clothes. His greedy look made it impossible for her to be angry. Cheen Amlin looked at her with a solemn expression, but his words were a little shameless. "Why don't you give her some? She's so greedy." When she said the last sentence, she glanced at him again, but she still carried little Mumu into the bedroom. Her movements were very natural, as if she still lived in this house. In fact, when she came here today, she didn't even take a step into the bedroom. Cheen Amlin didn't say that there was still a gap between them, so she wouldn't be so insensible. But now in front of Xiao Mian, she was still a little impulsive. She went to the bedroom and was about to close the door when Cheen Amlin followed her in and closed the door to look at her. She sat on the sofa by the window, unbuttoned her shirt, and comforted little Mumu. She looked down and said, "Go make some milk. Although her tone was calm, it was not without emotion. Qin Anlin stared at her for a while, but he still went out first and came back with the milk bottle. She reached out to take it, but it was empty. She looked up and saw that there seemed to be a small cluster of flames in his deep eyes, staring at a certain place. Yi Liangqiu snorted coldly. Haven't you seen enough of Xia Mian? He stood there for a while, then slowly walked over and stood beside her. His tall figure blocked out the light, making her feel a little oppressive in his shadow. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. After a long time, she couldn't bear it anymore and said, "Can you move aside a little?" He stretched out his hand and clenched it. She exclaimed, "Qin Anlin, what are you doing? Isn't it obvious?" He still didn't let go, but his voice was hoarse. "You suspect that I did this to her, don't you?" His gaze was lowered as he toyed with it slowly. His voice was restrained as he said, "There's actually a little more. Could he not be so shameless?" Her body shrunk. Her gaze lowered, but saw the unbearable. Qin Anlin. She was startled and angry at the same time. She really couldn't avoid it, so she picked up little Moo Moo and stuffed it into his arms. Qin Anlin withdrew his hand and focused on feeding the child. Just as Yi Liangqiu was about to pull up her clothes, the door opened. Xia Mian stood at the door and gasped when she saw Yi Liangqiu's disheveled clothes and the love bites all over her body. There were also a few obvious fingerprints so warm and dazzling. Yi Liangqiu looked at Xia Mian and then at Qin Anlin with a mocking look in her eyes. She slowly buttoned up her clothes, unhurriedly. Qin Anlin's voice was stern. "Get out. Aunt Sue asked me to call you for dinner." Xia Mian's voice continued to be low. However, Qin Anlin still ruthlessly interrupted her. "Get out." Chapter 16:57. Yi Liangqiu looked at them indifferently and didn't say anything. If she was really ashamed and angry, she wouldn't have stayed here but left. Xia Mian's biggest mistake was that she didn't know that no matter what happened between Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu, they had never divorced, and he had never applied for a divorce. Shamelessly pestering him like this, he couldn't even be considered a proper mistress. Qin Anlin fed little Moo Moo. As soon as the little girl finished eating, she was sleepy. She yawned and fell asleep in her father's arms. She held Qin Anlin with her fat little hands. Her fingernails were pink, and she looked so cute. Although Yi Liangqiu was reluctant, she felt that it was meaningless to stay. She carried little Moo Moo to the bed, kissed it, and said in a low voice, "I'll take Momo back." Half of the festival was over, and now there were 2 more people. They wouldn't be happy, so it was better to leave. After she said that, Qin Anlin looked at her and nodded after a moment of silence. "That's good." He looked at her again. "Go to the bathroom and tidy yourself up." After that, he left first. Yi Liangqiu was a little confused. She walked to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was like a peach blossom, and her eyes were full of moisture. It was obvious that something had happened. At least, she had fallen in love. Was that how Xia Mian saw her just now? She splashed her face with cold water. When she walked out, her expression had returned to normal. Qin Anlin picked up Momo and said, "Aunt Sue, I'll send them back." Su Shou nodded at Yi Liangqiu and then said to Qin Anlin unhappily, "Anlin, don't go out during the festival. Xia Mian is also here. Spend more time with her." There was nothing wrong with what she said, but it was too warm and could be misunderstood. Qin Anlin just smiled and ignored it. He didn't explain. Sometimes, actions were more powerful than explanations. Besides, it was good to make Yi Liangqiu misunderstand. "I'd better see you out," he said indifferently. Without looking at Xia Mian, he walked towards the door. Muyin sat down to eat. He sat upright, and his voice was crisp. "Daddy, Grandma Crispy, and Annie Xia will take care of me. Daddy doesn't have to come home so early." "Aunt Xia." Xia Mian's face turned pale as she recalled how Yi Muyun had pointed at her and called her a nanny a year ago. This was a great humiliation. Xia Mian's face darkened. She patted her hand and smiled. "Muyin likes you very much." Qin Anlin said nothing and left with Yi Liangqiu. After the door was closed, Crisp's sleeve said softly, "Anlin's temper is like this. You should give in to him." Xia Mian felt wronged and lowered her head. "I know. Tears fell down, and Crispy Shio couldn't bear to see it, so she tried to persuade him. Don't cry. I know you are a good child. Young master will definitely divorce her in the future, and he will understand how good you are. Xiao Mian's heart was comforted, and she said softly, Really? Crisp Sleeve said, Yes, of course. However, they didn't care about Mu Yun, who was beside them, when they said that. When Crisp Sleeve realized what they meant and saw the look in Mu Yun's eyes, she regretted it and stammered. Mu Yun, Grandma Crispy didn't mean that. Then what did she mean? Yi Mu Yun's little face was tense. Didn't you want Annie Xia to be my stepmother? His voice suddenly became strange, almost sharp. Get out! Get out of my house! Chapter 1658. But Xia Mian didn't think so. She hated Yi Mu Yun. This child's personality was the same as Yi Lianqiu's. Plus, he was brought up by Yi Lianqiu. No matter how good she was to him, he was an ingrate. Just as Xia Mian was about to explode, Crispy Sleeve stopped her. She said sternly, Xiao Xia, why are you being so calculative with a child? Crispy Sleeve knew better than Xia Mian. Right now, Xia Mian was nothing. If she really dared to argue with Mu Yun, the consequences would be dire. She probably wouldn't be able to survive in King Entertainment. That wasn't what Crispy Sleeve wanted to see. After her reminder, Xia Mian finally calmed down. She pursed her lips and said softly, I understand. Then, she put on a gentle look and said gently, Mu Yun, you've misunderstood. And he just wants to help you. Yi Mu Yun put down the cutlery in his hand and ignored her. Instead, he looked at Crispy Sleeve. Grandma Crispy, I want to take my afternoon nap. I don't want to be disturbed. Although he was young, he had the air of a young master. It was as if Xia Mian was an outsider. Crispy Sleeve had no choice. She couldn't lose her position in the Qin family for Xia Mian. So, she turned to look at Xia Mian and said pleasantly, Xiao Xia, why don't you go back first? Next time. Xia Mian was unwilling. How could she leave before President Qin came back? Although Crispy Sleeve looked gentle, she was actually very strong. At least in front of Xia Mian, she was strong. No matter how unwilling Xia Mian was, she could only swallow it and force a smile. Okay, Aunt Crispy, I'll go back first. She wanted to say goodbye to Mu Yun, but Mu Yun's little face was stiff. Xia Mian was still a little proud, so she couldn't bring herself to do it. In the end, she left first. As soon as she left, Crispy Sleeve hugged Mu Yun and coaxed him. However, no matter how she coaxed, the little guy was still unhappy. Crispy Sleeve looked at his little face. It looked so much like Yi Lianqiu, and she couldn't help but sigh. She did not want Mu Yun to lose his mother, but that person was Yi Lianqiu. She could not forgive him. While Mu Yun was taking a nap, Qin Amlin came back with a serious look on his face. Su Xiu had already packed everything and was sitting on the sofa watching TV. Seeing him return, she smiled faintly. You're back. Qin Amlin nodded and walked over to sit beside Su Xiu. He leaned back and wiped his face. Aunt Su, don't do this in the future. Crisp Sleeve tilted her head to look at him. Young master, I can't forget the scene of old Madame's departure. Could it be that young master has forgotten? Qin Amlin sighed. I didn't forget. When he said that, Chu Xiu's voice became agitated. Then why is young master still with her? Qin Amlin closed his eyes. Aunt Su, must we talk about this? Crisp Sleeve did not make a sound and only looked at him. Qin Amlin sat up slowly and smiled slightly bitterly. Aunt Su, the child needs a mother. You can also change their mother, can't you? For example, Mumu likes Xiao Xia very much. Crisp Sleeve's voice was a little agitated. Qin Amlin looked at her with a strange gaze. She had watched him grow up, and he had always respected her. But now, she had crossed the line without even realizing it. If it weren't for the old lady, Qin Amlin probably wouldn't have tolerated her interference in his private affairs. Xia Mian is an employee of King Entertainment. Don't bring her here in the future. Qin Amlin's tone was very indifferent. Chapter 1659. Qin Amlin felt sad for a moment. After a long time, he said calmly, She and I have 3 children. Soft Sleeve sighed. But Amlin, you have to have a new life. Even if you're divorced, You can let her see your children. She thought for a moment and said, there's no need to be ambiguous for a long time. It's not good to drag it out. Cheen Anlin walked to the bar and made himself a cup of coffee. He slowly took a sip and said in a low voice, I know what I'm doing. I'm afraid that you'll forget all that hatred. Soft Sleeve's tone was a bit heavy. Anlin, when the old lady left, you said that if she returned to the Sioux family, you would cut off all contact with her. Not only did you not divorce her, but now you're planning to be a loving couple again? Cheen Anlin slowly finished his coffee and looked at Soft Sleeve. He smiled bitterly. That's why you pushed Xiao Mian over, isn't it? Soft Sleeve paused for a moment. I'm doing it for your own good. If it's for that, you don't have to. Cheen Anlin looked down. Liang Xiao and I. It's impossible. With that, his gaze fell on Soft Sleeve's face. His expression was also indifferent. Soft Sleeve couldn't do anything to him. After a long time, she sighed. Anlin, don't try to fool me. She watched him grow up. How could she not know what he was thinking? He was clearly dragging it out with her. He and Yu Liangxiu had an ambiguous relationship. She saw it this time, but it didn't mean that there wouldn't be a next time. It just meant that she probably wouldn't bring him home again. Thinking of this, she said unhappily, of course I know that I've overstepped my boundaries. But Anlin, I'm just worried about you. She's too cruel. The old lady is gone just like that. How can I watch young master sink into it again? Soft Sleeve closed her eyes. If you guys really reconcile, the old lady's old subordinates won't let you go. By then, the future of King Entertainment will really be uncertain. Cheen Anlin smiled. Aunt Sue, you don't have to worry about the company. You can just brush me off. Although Soft Sleeve forced a smile, she still didn't agree with Yi Liangxiu. However, her words made Cheen Anlin's eyes darken. What Qingxiu said was not without reason. He had some understanding of Liangxiu. Seeing that Cheen Anlin was deep in thought, Milky Sleeve didn't stay any longer. She helped to take care of the household matters before leaving. Sitting alone, Cheen Anlin thought back to when he saw Yu Liangxiu wearing the watch he bought in the car. She didn't say anything and just put it on. How could he not know that he was in her heart? Otherwise, she wouldn't have let him touch her again and again. Cheen Anlin smiled faintly, his smile a little bitter. If he could control it, he wouldn't have to do this. He didn't want to have anything to do with her, but some things couldn't be controlled. On one hand, he hated her, and on the other, he loved her. From that day onwards, he and Yi Liangxiu entered a period of indifference. Yi Liangxiu was also busy and didn't look for him. They were probably guarding their own pride. The top-floor office of the ATV. Linda knocked on the door with a document in hand. Yi Liangxiu didn't look up. She asked lightly, "What's the matter?" Chapter 1660. Yi Liangxiu put down the pen in her hand, looked up, and said in a flat tone, "You look angry." Of course, her drama series is popular on ATV, and she promised to come to our New Year's Eve, but now she's back on her word. Linda said angrily, "We shouldn't have supported her in the first place." Yi Liangxiu smiled. "Look at you again. You're getting more and more impatient." Linda was still angry. "I just hate how she pretends to be a white lotus outside, but secretly steals." Linda didn't dare to say the rest of her words. "If it belongs to me, she won't be able to take it away even if she steals it." Yi Liangxiu looked at her. "Also, Xiao Mian will definitely be popular, but the important thing is how much ATV will benefit from this. The shareholders will be convinced and the stock will rise. These are the most important things." However, the most important thing was to gain Su Shiqing's trust. That way, the next step of her plan would be easier to carry out. Yi Liangxiu smiled faintly. It's reasonable that she chose Mango TV. Anyway, she's still ungrateful. Linda's eyes were spitting fire. Yi Liangxiu was amused. "Linda, after all you've said, is that all you've said?" Linda didn't say anything, and after a long time, she asked softly, "Then our New Year's Eve is obviously not big enough." "I invited Ran." Yi Liangxiu said calmly. "Didn't Xiao Mian always want to work with Ran?" "Linda, you can release this news." Linda was terrified. "Ran, oh my God." He rarely participated in these activities, and the price was sky high. Acting out of friendship, Yi Liangxiu blinked. "I think you like the thrill of Xiao Mian begging you." Linda's eyes lit up. Really? Of course. Yu Liangxiu smiled. Now inform the publicity department to plan it. Linda nodded. Yeah, I think with Ran, we won't have to worry about the viewership ratings anymore. By the way, contact some of the artists who are still on the fence. Maybe some of them will change their minds. Yu Liangxiu ordered indifferently. Give me the name list, and I'll take a look. Linda hesitated for a moment before asking, Where's Xiao Mian? Yu Liangxiu looked straight at Linda and said slowly, Didn't you say she was ungrateful? When she said that, Linda immediately understood and nodded. Okay, Mr. Yi, I understand. Linda acted very quickly. ATV hyped up the news that Ran was going to participate in the New Year celebrations. Just as Yu Liangxiu expected, a lot of artists signed contracts with Mango TV and ATV at the same time. After all, it was just a recording. Xia Mian, who had been quiet for 2 days, came to ATV in person. She probably couldn't persuade Jia, so she had to come herself. After summer solstice, Xia Mian was broadcast. Xia Mian became a little more popular. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was one of the 4 most popular female stars. Most importantly, she was young. The other female stars were almost 30, but Xia Mian was only 22 or 23. She was young and full of vigor, so when it came to ATV, she demanded an exorbitant price. She agreed to ATV's New Year's recording, but the appearance fee was 10 million. Linda sneered in her heart. 10 million? Why don't you just rob a bank? Who do you think you are? You can't even compare to one of Mr. Ye's fingers back then. 10 million. How can your face be bigger than AP share? Linda said with a smile, Our ATV isn't as rich as King Entertainment. The appearance fee is 10 million. So, Miss Xia, I'm afraid we can't afford you. Chapter 1661. Haven't you heard the phrase, priceless? Linda was still smiling. She really wanted to tell Xia Mian that the door was right there and that she should take care. Xia Mian thought for a moment. 8 million, no lower. Linda coughed lightly. Miss Xia, can you sing? Yes. Representative work? Linda smiled. Xia Mian didn't have any representative work. She forced a smile. I can cover other people's songs. You don't have a representative work. It's not worth much. Linda looked regretful. Xia Mian pursed her lips, feeling a little humiliated. Who didn't flatter her these days? Then we have nothing to talk about. Xia Mian was arrogant. Plus, she was a little popular recently, so she put on her sunglasses and proudly left. Her assistant, Little Red, also followed and glared at Linda. Like master, like servant. Linda said to Yi Liangxiu when she reported to Yi Liangxiu. Yi Liangxiu smiled. She can't stand this kind of anger now. She paused. But she won't give up. She'll probably find a way to get close to Ran. Although Xia Mian was popular, she wasn't completely popular yet. She was really ambitious. She wanted to open up the international market, so she kept her eyes on the Asian superstar, Ran. She's very smart. But without the resources of King Entertainment, it's impossible for her to do it on her own. Yi Liangxiu looked at Linda. Leak, the hotel where Ran is staying. Linda was stunned. Ran is very upright, but his agent isn't, Yi Liangxiu said indifferently. It took Linda a long time to come back to her senses. Mr. Yi, you mean? I don't mean anything. It just depends on how big her appetite is. Yi Liangxiu's tone was very calm. She lowered her head as she said this. It took Linda a long time to realize that Mr. Yi was going to make a move on Xia Mian. At the very least, he couldn't suppress her openly, so he was going to use underhanded means. Mr. Yi had been in the entertainment industry for a long time, but compared to Mr. Yi, Xia Mian was so naive and stupid. However, Linda was still secretly wondering if Mr. Yi was doing this to compete with King Entertainment or because of a personal grudge. Personally, she was more inclined to settle a personal grudge. She did not dare to say these words to Mr. Yi. She only dared to think about it secretly. Half a month before the Spring Festival, ATV's New Year's recording was about to begin. When Ran arrived in B City, Yi Liangxiu personally drove to the airport to pick him up, accompanied by Linda. Ran was wearing sunglasses and was 185 centimeters tall. Although it was winter and he was dressed all in black, the cold aura he exuded could make anyone kneel down and lick them. The fans at the airport were screaming crazily and shouting Rand's name. In the end, he had to take the VIP passage to escape. Rand's agent knew Chinese, so they didn't have to go through the trouble of translating. After getting into the car, the agent, Che Tai-hsien, took another look at Linda. Yi Liangqiu coughed lightly. He has a girlfriend. The man's eyes widened. He looked at Linda for a long time before saying something meaningful. I can't tell. Linda looked at the middle-aged pervert, smiled, and didn't say anything. She knew what Mr. Yi meant. He didn't want this old thing to have any ideas about her. Rand sat, took off his sunglasses, and said calmly, Don't have any ideas about her. Che Tai-hsien also used Korean. I understand. Then he became more obedient. Yi Liangqiu took Rand to the GM hotel and checked into the presidential suite. Chapter 1662. In the elegant environment, Yi Liangqiu and Rand sat face to face, with their assistants on each side. Yi Liangqiu and Rand met when they were filming a music video. They had been very close ever since, but they kept a low profile and no one knew about it. This time, Xiao Mian had purposely delayed ATV's New Year's Eve party to make things difficult for them. However, she had never expected that Yi Liangqiu would be able to invite Ran, who was Xiao Mian's idol and someone she wanted to be friends with even in her dreams. He was the hottest superstar in Asia. When Xiao Mian came over to meet him, she was accompanied by her assistant. Although they were in a restaurant, she was wearing sunglasses and looked very stylish. However, the dress she was wearing was very tight. The black dress accentuated her curves, and the assistant was holding her jacket. When she saw Yi Liangqiu, she paused for a moment and then greeted politely, Hello, Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu knew what was going on and smiled. Miss Xiao, what a coincidence. Yeah, it's better to meet by chance than to meet by chance. Xiao Mian's tone was a bit emotional, but Ran was Korean and didn't understand her at all, nor was he interested in listening. After Xiao Mian's greeting, there was a bit of an awkward silence because Yi Liangqiu didn't respond to her anymore. Xiao Mian glanced at Ran as if she had just seen him. She was like a little girl seeing her idol. Ran? Oh my God, why are you here? Ran looked up at Xiao Mian with a puzzled expression. Did he know this woman? Xiao Mian still looked a bit bashful. She put her palms together and asked, Can I have your autograph? Ran's agent, Che Tai-hsien, whispered something into his ear. Ran frowned but still picked up the pen, not knowing where to sign. At this time, Xiao Mian stretched out a snow-white arm and said in a sweet voice, Sign here. Ran glanced at her with a strange look in his eyes. Xiao Mian smiled sweetly. Linda leaned close to Yi Liangqiu's ear and whispered, Look, this woman is too realistic. Her attitude toward President Qin was ambiguous before, but now she looks like a love-struck fool when she sees this Korean. Yi Liangqiu smiled and whispered in his ear, This Korean is married. Secret marriage? Linda's eyes lit up. Yi Liangqiu was still smiling. Ran's wife's family was very powerful, so he didn't have the guts to cheat on her. Plus, he didn't care about a woman like Xiao Mian, who sent herself to his doorstep. However, it was hard to say for his agent. Linda also looked like she was watching a good show. She sat on the side and watched Xiao Mian put on a monologue. After a moment of hesitation, Ran took the pen and wrote on Xiao Mian's white and tender arm. He wrote with all his might. Ugh, it hurts. Tears welled up in Xiao Mian's eyes. She looked up at Ran, hoping that he would take pity on her. However, Ran didn't understand Chinese. He just put away the pen and didn't say anything else. He treated Xiao Mian like an ordinary fan. After that, Ran and Yi Liangqiu conversed in English. They talked about the local customs of China, which was completely personal. Xiao Mian didn't know how to respond. It was a bit awkward for her to be here. Fortunately, Ran's agent handed her a business card. Miss Xia, I've seen your performance. It was very good. If there's a chance in the future, we can work together. Xiao Mian was flattered. She took the business card and left in a decent manner. When they saw Yi Liangqiu, they were also surprisingly polite. Mr. Yi, I won't disturb your meal. Chapter 1663. Xiao Mian and her assistant, Little Red walked to the door of the restaurant. Little Red snorted. What? Yi Liangxiu is so arrogant. You didn't even stand up. She's Mr. Yi, and I'm an artist. Xiao Mian said lightly. It's normal to be disrespectful. You weren't like this when you begged us to come to New Year's Eve. The assistant added fuel to the fire. Now you've invited a Korean back, and he's amazing. I wonder if there's something going on between them. Xiao Mian looked at the assistant thoughtfully, and after a while, she whispered into her ear, Find me a paparazzi, a reliable one. The assistant looked at Xiao Mian and then smiled darkly. After Xiao Mian left, Yi Liangxiu took care of Rand for dinner and then sent him back to his hotel room. I'll take you on a night tour of B City at 8 p.m. Let's have skewers. Rand clenched his fists. It was rare for him to let go of his coldness. He gently patted her on the shoulder. Liangxiu, I'll wait for you. They were good buddies, and in Rand's heart, Liangxiu was of the same gender, so they wouldn't avoid each other. Besides, his wife also liked Liangxiu. Yi Liangxiu smiled and left with Linda. As they walked, Yi Liangxiu said in a low voice, Clear your schedule after 4 p.m. Also, is the food guide ready? Because it was a private trip, she hoped that Rand's trip would be worthwhile. This time, he didn't charge anything, which was a huge favor. Linda nodded. Rand is very easygoing. Although he looked cold, he took care of people and treated Mr. Yi very well. She could see that. Yi Liangxiu nodded and didn't say anything else. However, when they turned a corner, she noticed a flash of light. She smiled faintly. It seemed that someone couldn't wait. At night, Yi Liangxiu and Rand went out alone. They both wore sunglasses and masks, and no one knew them. They had a lot of fun. Yi Liangxiu noticed that there was a camera in the dark, but she ignored it. They strolled around B City's night market together. Rand was especially interested in eating skewers. The two of them actually ate more than 700 yuan. I can't take it anymore. Yi Liangxiu reached out to touch her stomach. I'm so full. Rand rested his hands on the bench behind him and said with a smile, It tastes very good. It tastes better than our soaked rice. Of course, if you have the time, I can bring you to try a lot of Chinese delicacies, as long as you dare. Yi Liangxiu had not been able to relax for a long time. There was no pressure when he was with Rand. It was pleasant. As for Amlin, she was very happy to see him, but she had to worry about whether she would say something wrong at any time. She had a struggle between love and hate for him, so she was not as happy as now. Shall we go for a drink? She suggested. Rand readily agreed. However, he still politely called his wife. I'm going to go for a drink with Liangxiu. We might get drunk. What do you think? He deliberately said it in English, so Yi Liangxiu could understand him. She pointed at him and laughed to death. Rand had the coldest appearance, but he was a good man. He did not have any scandals and was very loyal to his wife. She was laughing. Rand looked at her and suddenly passed the phone in his hand to her. She wants to talk to you. Yi Liangxiu stopped laughing and looked at him. However, she still picked up the call. She had met Rand's wife a few times. She was the one who hosted her when she went to Korea. When she picked up the call, Mrs. Rand pleaded politely, Liangxiu, you have to protect him. Chapter 1664. Yi Liangxiu said to Mrs. Rand in a serious tone, I will protect him until he returns home safely. After hanging up the phone, Rand smiled and said, Please, Liangxiu. She stood up and said, Stop it. The night wind blew her long hair up, wrapping it around both of their bodies. Rand was especially gentlemanly as he helped her tame her hair. Together, they took a taxi to the night bar. As expected, they were both drunk. However, Rand was the one protecting Yi Liangxiu. But in the second half of the night, someone somehow recognized Rand in the dark, and the scene became chaotic. People screamed and cried, and the crowd quickly rushed over. Run! Although they drank a little too much, they still knew the consequences. Yi Liangxiu pulled Rand and ran on the streets of B City, with a group of crazy fans chasing after them. Finally, when they returned to his hotel, both of them were exhausted. One fell on the bed, and the other lay on the sofa. They didn't even take a shower, and to spend the night like that, of course, the next day, Yi Liangxiu's figure as she left the hotel, as well as the photo of her running hand in hand with Rand last night, quickly made all the headlines. Cheating, indulging in private life, indiscreet. All these words were crazily used on Yi Liangxiu. ATV was once again faced with a crisis. Just before the new year, everyone predicted that Yi Liangxiu's public image would collapse. This time, the ratings would be terrible, including Yi Liangxiu's confidant, Linda. Linda looked at her boss's calm expression and couldn't help but feel anxious. "Mr. Yi, aren't you going to clarify?" "Clarify what?" Yi Liangxiu smiled. "With Rand? Of course, I can't let someone else slander me like that," Linda said angrily. "It must be Xiao Mian. Since you know she did it, why are you so anxious?" Yi Liangxiu was extremely calm. "Besides, this wasn't slander on my head, but President Qin?" Linda exclaimed. After thinking about it carefully, she also understood. Yes, if Mr. Yi cheated, wouldn't it mean that President Qin was cuckolded? As long as Qin Amlin doesn't want a divorce, then he will definitely clean up this piece share. Yi Liangxiu looked at Linda, and ATV just happened to hype it up. Linda didn't say anything for a long time. After a long time, she mumbled, "Mr. Yi, isn't this too cruel to President Qin?" "Cruel?" Yi Liangxiu shook her head. She had already done the cruelest thing to him. This was nothing at all. Moreover, if she didn't do anything, how could she win Su Shirqing's trust? What was the next step of her plan? "Amlin, maybe you hate me and loathe me, but when you hate me, I'm even sadder than you. I'm doing all this against my original intentions. I'm slowly turning into something I don't like. And it's also something you hate." Just as Yi Liangxiu and Linda were talking, King Entertainment was in the center of the storm. Obviously, the reporters were most interested in Qin Amlin's reaction to today's explosive news. Everyone's mentality was the same. When your wife falls in love with someone else and wants to stay in the same hotel room, they all want to see your reaction. Qin Amlin sat in his office with a newspaper spread out in front of him. The photos on the newspaper were very high definition. There were her and Rand sitting together on the street, eating skewers, smiling at each other, and Rand holding her long hair. They were both dressed in black, like a couple's outfit. Qin Amlin found that he couldn't control his crazy thoughts. Chapter 1665. The veins on his forehead bulged as he gripped the newspaper in his hand. Kaim stood to the side and cautiously reminded him in a soft voice, "Rand got married in June of this year." "Of course I know that." Qin Amlin put down the newspaper and put his finger on it. "But these photos are here." His gaze was slightly cold. "Any news from ATV?" Kaim looked sympathetically at Chairman Qin and slowly said, "There's no movement. Is she so sure that I'll help her?" Qin Amlin's tone was a little angry. He slammed his palm on the table with a loud bang. Kaim silently thought to himself, it must be very painful. But the fact that there's a green cloud over President Qin's head must be what makes him so angry. He had to admit that Yi Liangxiu was really ruthless and courageous. Kaim actually took pleasure in her misfortune. This time, President Qin was probably in a real headache. Qin Amlin pondered for a moment. "Help me make an appointment with Rand and Yi Liangxiu." The last three words were said through gritted teeth. Kaim could feel how unwilling he was. He was also stunned for a moment before he understood what Qin Amlin meant. He had to admit that this was a really good move. Instead of wasting his breath explaining, it was better to be magnanimous and let the rumors stop in the hands of the wise. Then, rumors would remain rumors. "Aren't you afraid that Mr. Yi will make some excessive demands?" Kaim hesitated for a moment. Qin Amlin looked up, and his gaze fell straight on Kaim's face. He slowly said, "The instigator." Kaim knew that President Qin wasn't muddle-headed from anger. He went out and contacted Rand's agent. The two of them arranged to have a meal together. Of course, some people had to be sacrificed. Originally, King Entertainment wouldn't have done something like this. They wouldn't have given up on their principles. But Kaim knew that this time, Qin Amlin was really angry. What Xiao Mian had done could only be resolved by herself. No matter what method she used, only she would bear the consequences. Rand did not immediately agree. His answer was, "I need to ask Liangxiu." When Kaim told Qin Amlin the exact words, the golden pen in Qin Amlin's hand broke into two. He gritted his teeth, "Call Yi Liangxiu." Kaim held back her laughter. President Qin was furious. He called Yi Liangxiu. Yi Liangxiu naturally didn't make things difficult for him, because she really needed Qin Anlin to help her clear her name. Kim reported to Qin Anlin. Mr. Yi said she's fine. Qin Anlin snorted. Of course, there's no problem with those who have done wrong. Kim stifled a laugh. President Qin, are you saying that Mr. Yi has something to do with Ran? Qin Anlin glared at him, and Kim didn't dare to say anything else. After he left, Qin Anlin's body lay heavily on the back of the chair behind him. He felt a sense of helplessness in his heart. She knew him too well, so she always calculated everything. Of course, he could be a little more ruthless. If he did that, all her efforts would be wasted, and ATV would only have one breath left. But it wasn't that simple. He always felt that if he did that, he would really be at the end of the road. Unknowingly, he seemed to have compromised. In this smokeless smoke, he was actually quietly waiting for Su Shichang to die of old age. When did he, Qin Anlin, become like this? It was all because he couldn't bear to part with her. He got up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and looked at the scenery of B City. Chapter 1666. He stood so tall, but he was lonely. The person who had been by his side was no longer there, but in the opposite direction. Yi Liangxiu, what are you doing? What do you want to do? On the eve of ATV's New Year's Eve, Qin Anlin met up with RNA with a green glow. Of course, in addition to Kim, he also brought Xiao Mian. On Ran's side, it was Che Taixian. For this meeting, Qin Anlin instructed his media outlets to write the headline, King Entertainment's President Qin Anlin and his wife entertain the King of Asia, Ran. They got along so well, it couldn't be that they had been cuckolded, right? Qin Anlin's interaction with Ran was a bit stiff, but Yi Liangxiu was very calm. Xiao Mian gritted her teeth. It was obvious that President Qin was wiping her, but for Yi Liangxiu. However, she had a smile on her face and toasted Che Taixian from time to time. She was still counting on this man to pull some strings for her to cooperate with Ran. While she was drunk, Yi Liangxiu went to the bathroom. Standing in front of the basin, she slowly washed her hands. Suddenly, someone appeared behind her. Miss Xia, did you drink too much? Yi Liangxiu smiled faintly. Xiao Mian leaned to the side and looked at Yi Liangxiu coldly. Don't think that I don't know what you're playing. Yi Liangxiu continued washing her hands and smiled. I don't quite understand what you mean, Miss Xia. She smiled lightly. Does this have something to do with you, Miss Xia? Xiao Mian stared at Yi Liangxiu. Why did you ask me to film ATV's New Year's Eve for free? Xiao Mian wanted to be famous, but she also needed money. She didn't want to participate in an event like this without a reward, not to mention that she was arranged to dance for Ran. Yi Liangxiu looked at Xiao Mian. You're not satisfied? Although she was smiling, there was no smile in her eyes at all. Xiao Mian was stunned. After a while, she pursed her lips and squeezed out a few words. I don't want to go. Yi Liangxiu chuckled, wiped her hands, and looked at Xiao Mian. Sure, I think we'll be very busy that night, and there might be a few waitresses missing. Miss Xia, you look great in a cheongsam. Xiao Mian was so angry that her lips were trembling. Yi Liangxiu, you've gone too far. Yi Liangxiu's eyes darkened. Miss Xia, you don't need me to remind you of what you have done, do you? Xiao Mian was stunned. After a while, she shrieked, Did you do it on purpose? I didn't ask the paparazzi to follow us. Yi Liangxiu sneered. Xiao Mian, you're on your own now. Putting up with it once didn't mean he would put up with it every time. Xiao Mian stared at her back, unwilling to give up. She lost her mind and shouted at her back. Do you dare say that there's nothing going on between you and that Korean? Did nothing happen between the two of you in the same room? Yi Liangxiu slowly turned around and looked at Xiao Mian. What does that have to do with you? Xiao Mian was stunned for a moment. In the end, she had nothing to say. After Yi Liangxiu left, Xiao Mian's body slid down to the ground. Tears slowly flowed down her face. She had tried everything she could, but she couldn't touch Yi Liangxiu at all. Instead, she had put herself in an awkward position. She couldn't give up. She really couldn't. But what could she do, no matter how unwilling she was? In the end, Xiao Mian participated in ATV's New Year's Eve show for free, while Yi Liangxiu joined King Entertainment's tale. Yi Liangxiu had taken advantage of the situation. Chapter 1667. She was a popular actress. How could she do such a lowly job? However, she had to do it, because President Qin had guessed or was certain that she was behind Ran and Yi Liangxiu's headlines. When she left the hotel, Little Red helped her out. Tonight, Xiao Mian needed to get drunk. As long as she was drunk, she would have the courage. Wasn't the entertainment industry full of unspoken rules? She just needed to get used to it. Qin Anlin didn't like her. Was it because she wasn't high enough? If one day she could stand in the limelight like Yi Liangxiu, would President Qin take a second look at her? Yes, that must be it. When she was drunk, she dug out Rand's agent's phone number from her purse. Her eyes were a bit disillusioned. She stared at it for a long time, crying and laughing at the same time. Finally, she dialed the number. What awaited her was the erosion of the night. It was destruction, but she knew that if she didn't give, how could she get? She wanted to be the diva of Asia. That night, she slept next to a strange man. She slept next to that middle-aged man, and her body was wantonly treated by that man. She resisted the urge to vomit and pretended to be happy. She could only swallow those tears. The night was long. For Yi Liangxiu, tonight was also torture. Qin Anlin had personally taken off her green hat, but it didn't mean that he would let her go. After everyone left, he was still sitting on the sofa in the private room. He had a headache, probably because he had drunk a little too much. He rubbed his forehead with his fingers. For a long time, he didn't speak. Kam and Linda were responsible for seeing the guests off. Only the two of them were left in the spacious private room. Yi Liangxiu looked at him quietly and slowly walked over. She took over his hand and massaged his forehead with her fingers. She was startled when her hand was suddenly caught. He grabbed her hand, raised it high, and looked at her with a burning gaze. "It's not my head that hurts, it's here." He pointed at his heart with one hand. Yi Liangxiu fell on the carpet and called him softly, "Anlin." His fingers were still tightly gripping hers. He stared into her eyes and asked word by word, "Why did you do this?" Since she didn't say anything, he continued, "Yi Liangxiu, don't pretend to be innocent in front of me. You knew that Xiao Mian had hired paparazzi to follow her, so why did you let them take those photos?" She half knelt on the ground and looked up at him in a humble manner. Suddenly, she smiled. "Yes, I know." She struggled, but failed. Enduring the pain, she fearlessly looked into his eyes. "Qin Anlin, do you feel uncomfortable looking at the photos? But Xiao Mian is always around you. Don't I feel bad?" She paused and closed her eyes. "Actually, she can enter and leave your apartment freely." "Qin Anlin, how did you restrain yourself at that time?" She questioned him in a cold voice. Qin Anlin stared at her for a long time before he said softly, "So, this is your counterattack?" "Yes." Her expression was a little stubborn and willful. "I don't like her being around you." After saying that, she stared at him and never looked away. "Yi Liangxiu, do you know what you're saying?" His voice was extremely hoarse. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything. How could she not know? Her body was suddenly pulled into his arms. Then his slightly tipsy lips sealed her mouth. Chapter 1668. He kissed her wantonly, filled with anger and indignation. Yi Liangxiu raised her head. Her lips were occupied by him, and she felt as though her neck was about to break. They were already very close to each other, but he still held her waist and pressed her against his body. She struggled in a sorry state, but the more she struggled, the more pathetic she looked. The fragrance of the wine mixed with the scent of a man and a woman's eyes was intoxicating. She didn't know when, but she had fallen limply into his arms. Her fingers held onto his shoulders, and her long nails left a long scratch on his expensive clothing. It went all the way to his waist before he managed to catch it. She cried out softly, "Anlin!" He was drunk and even angrier, but he had no intention of venting his anger in a private room. Leaving her lips, he stared deeply into her eyes. He pursed his lips and said coldly, "Get up." She was dazed for a moment before realizing that she was sitting on his lap in a shameful position. "Can't bear to get up?" He narrowed his eyes, and his slender fingers hooked onto her chin, forcing her to look at him. At this moment, the two of them weren't in a good state. Both of their eyes were misty, and there was a lingering passion in them. Under his gaze, her body trembled slightly. She shrunk back, wanting to get down, but was held back by him again. Liangxiu. He pressed her tightly into his arms. She buried her face in the side of his neck, feeling his body temperature. He was very hot, the kind of heat that was about to burn. If there's a way, I also want to forget you, or even divorce. He spoke quietly, as though he wasn't drunk. However, she knew that he was drunk, or else he wouldn't have said those words. His arms were holding her in place with a brutal force, and his voice was hoarse. But you use my feelings time and time again. His tone was bleak, and there was a rare sense of despair. Liangxiu laid on his shoulder. She wanted to struggle, but she didn't dare. She believed that if she dared to move at this moment, he would consign her to eternal damnation. Liangxiu, how can you be so cruel? His face shifted slightly. Every inch of his movement felt like it was ironing her skin. Her pores felt like they were being ironed by scorching lava, and they were scorching hot. She had nowhere to retreat and could only stare into his eyes. Her swollen red lips trembled slightly. His face pressed against hers. It was very tight and hotter than ever before. She could barely move, and he was hot everywhere. Although his voice was soft, she could feel his anger. She had nothing to say. She had done exactly as he had said. Liangxiu, you're amazing. He closed his eyes and slowly said, don't force me to attack you. After saying that, he turned her face and his voice became cold and hard. Are you in such a hurry to see me? They hadn't been intimate since Christmas, but they did see each other. Firstly, he was soft-hearted and wanted her to see the child. Secondly, he wanted to see Mo. He always wanted to minimize the damage, but he didn't expect that she was really cruel. She could even destroy her own reputation, so what else couldn't she do? Liangxiu lowered her eyes. Anlin, I don't know what you're talking about. Chapter 1669. She suddenly looked up and looked at him anxiously. Anlin. He abruptly let go of her and smiled faintly. Liangxiu, are you still there? His hand was on her chest, as if he was holding on to her heart. She looked at him and felt embarrassed, as though she had been seen through. She thought about it before answering him slowly. Yes, I've always been there. But he didn't let her go and asked urgently, are you still as innocent as before? She didn't say anything. Qin Anlin's slender and beautiful hand supported his forehead. The dim yellow light shone on his face, leaving a side profile for her. She looked, her fingers gently landing on his palm, tightly interlocking with his fingers. Her face was also pressed against his palm, murmuring, Anlan, my love is still here. This is the most important thing. He turned his head and looked at her. After a long time, he said lightly, but I don't dare to love you anymore. At some point, probably when he fell in love with her, he lost his courage. He gently pushed her hand away and stood up slowly. That's it. After dealing with the matter, he was unprecedentedly disheartened. What he valued and protected were not the most important things to her. The most important thing to her was to keep her ATV. Liangxiu was pushed away by him, and her body fell on the sofa. And Qin Anlin's heart was filled with desolation as he walked towards the door step by step. She looked at him in a daze and suddenly got up. The next second, she hugged him from behind. Qin Anlin's body froze and his voice was slightly cold. What do you mean by this? Don't go, she said a little rascally and then buried her face behind him, acting coquettishly. Qin Anlin's originally cold and hard heart suddenly softened a little. He turned his head and said in a low voice, Liangxiu, do you know what this means? I know. Her tone was even softer as she leaned her whole body against him. It was also a kind of seduction. He was well aware that he couldn't resist such temptation. He suddenly turned his head and looked at her with burning eyes. Liangxiu pursed her lips and gently went forward, hugging his waist and burying her face in his chest. Anlin, let's call a truce, okay? When she said that, her breath was on the side of his neck. His body stiffened, and then he lowered his head. He was very close to her. His nose was touching hers, and his deep eyes were also very close to hers. His voice was hoarse. "You want to sleep with me, right?" She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Yes." Cheen Anlin narrowed his eyes tightly. He suddenly picked her up and walked straight outside. The receptionist of the GM hotel looked as if she was facing a formidable enemy. She stammered, "The compendium, the post-mortem medicine, and the wound medicine have all been prepared. We will also deliver breakfast to you tomorrow morning." Cheen Anlin carried Yi Liangxiu horizontally, but his gaze was slightly cold. He didn't look anxious at all. "Help me get a room next to Rand," he said calmly. The receptionist hesitated. "But little boss, Pei, has already prepared a long-term suite for President Cheen." I said next to Rand. Cheen Anlin threw the black gold card down. "Also, prepare double the things I mentioned just now." "Double? Would Jean die tomorrow? Would he have to collect his corpse?" The receptionist hesitated. Cheen Anlin repeated, "Do you need me to call your little boss, Pei?" Chapter 1670. Therefore, the receptionist quickly checked them in and invited them to the suite next to Rand's. "Is the soundproofing good?" Cheen Anlin placed Yi Liangxiu on the sofa and asked with raised eyebrows. The receptionist put down 2 big boxes of textbooks and trauma medicine. She was silently praying for Yi Liangxiu. After hearing Cheen Anlin's words, she smiled and said, "President Cheen, don't worry. GM Hotel has the best soundproofing. As long as you close the windows, you won't be able to hear anything outside." However, she quickly understood what President Cheen meant. She smiled warmly and said, "President Cheen, you can enjoy yourself to your heart's content. The people next door won't hear you." "What if the windows are open?" Cheen Anlin lit a cigarette and asked calmly. The receptionist was stunned. She looked a little uncomfortable and said, "Then keep your voice down." How shameful. How loud and how much strength did he have to use to worry about such a problem? Cheen Anlin looked deeply at Yi Liangxiu and then waved the receptionist away. He didn't start eating immediately. Instead, he stood by the window, opened it, and smoked 2 cigarettes. Yi Liangxiu was still sitting on the sofa, as if she was waiting for his verdict. In fact, she knew what he was thinking, but she was willing to indulge him. Cheen Anlin put out the cigarette and turned his body slightly. He waved and said, "Come here." She slowly got up, walked over to him, and hugged him from behind. "Anlin." He lit another cigarette and said coldly, "Kiss me." She tightened her grip and put her lips on the back of his neck. Their lips touched. She was really dilly-dallying. It was the same 2 kisses back and forth. She didn't hit him at all. He thought he was calm, but after a long time, he couldn't help it. After smoking a cigarette, his whole body was on fire. He turned sideways and hugged her to the front, kissing her fiercely. "Yi Liangxiu, there's no one more despicable than you." She was carried to the balcony in his arms. He was torturing her so that she would make a sound of shame. Next door, Rand was video chatting with his wife on the balcony. He couldn't help but hear the commotion. After a long time, he finally recognized Yi Liangxiu's voice. At first, he was stunned, then he smiled. In the end, he didn't close the window. If that man did it on purpose, then he would fulfill his wish. It was really childish and adorable. That night, Yi Liangxiu finally understood what it meant to be better off dead than alive. He only let her go when it was almost dawn. In the end, the 2 of them caught a cold together. She had a simple cold, but Cheen Anlin had an overdose. Although he was still alive, his corpse was not far from being collected. By the time the front desk brought breakfast over, the bedroom was in a state of chaos. It looked like a battlefield. She swallowed her saliva and called the doctor. Yi Liangxiu was fine. She only took medicine, but Cheen Anlin had to be put on a 4-drip. It would be embarrassing to go to the hospital, so she hung up on the spot. Linda came over at noon. She looked at President Cheen, who was lying on the bed, and felt sorry for him. It must have been tough last night. Yi Liangxiu whispered something in her ear. Linda hesitated, but she still went. After they left, Yi Liangxiu covered Cheen Anlin with the blanket. She was the one who suffered last night, but he was the one who was sick. No matter how cruel she was, She couldn't abandon him at such a time. However, where her hand touched the blanket, he caught it. Chapter 1671. Yuliancio lowered her head and looked at him. Sheen Amlin's gaze was gloomy. His body was weak, but he was still unwilling to let go of her and held her stubbornly. At this moment, he was like a rascal child. Yuliancio followed his strength and laid down on his lower abdomen. Through the blanket, she hugged his waist. "Amlin, can you sleep?" She looked up and said in a gentle voice. He lay there, his face a little red. That was the after effect of... He slowly reached out his large palm and held her hair. It was so soft and obedient. She lay there obediently and hugged him tightly with her slender arms. She buried her face in his chest and slept with him. Sheen Amlin was angry at first, but he was really tired. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. When he woke up, it was already in the afternoon. When he opened his eyes, his hands immediately moved downward until he touched her hair. Only then did he feel relieved. A groan sounded from his throat. The person on top of him woke up. He looked up. "Amlin." Sheen Amlin pursed his lips and closed his eyes again. "Go get me a glass of water." His fever had subsided, but his body was still weak. Besides him, there was only her in this suite. Yuliancio propped herself up and reached out to touch his forehead. Only then did she feel relieved. She got off the bed and walked toward the living room. Sheen Amlin turned sideways to look at her back view. Even though she had given birth to 3 children, her figure was still as beautiful as before. The bathrobe was loosely tied around her waist. Her long hair was slightly damp, and it was as alluring as seaweed. Just by looking at her, he could understand why he had been so indulgent last night. To him, she was the best medicine in the village. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared from the bedroom door and came back after a while with a glass of water and 2 pills in her hands. Sheen Amlin propped himself up and looked at her. "I'm fine now." This meant that he didn't want to take the medicine. Only then did Yuliancio remember that she had been with him for so long, but she had never seen him get sick. This was the first time she had seen him like this, afraid of taking medicine. However, her heart was filled with tenderness. In their love-hate relationship, when he despised her like this, she felt something akin to taking care of a child. It turned out that he could also be fragile, and he also needed to be coaxed. Yuliancio put the glass of water on the bedside table, spread out the medicine in her hand, and looked at him. Afraid of taking medicine? Sheen Amlin looked a little uneasy. He coughed lightly and said, "Of course not." "Then eat for me to see." She moved her hand forward and brought it to his lips. Her expression was that of a little sister. Sheen Amlin looked up at her, his gaze unfathomable. He lowered his head to look at the medicine in her palm. He couldn't see the medicine clearly. He could only see her white palm and beautiful fingers. He remembered that these hands were so lifelike. As he thought of this, his body ached a little. He narrowed his eyes and looked at her. "Feed me." His voice was already hoarse. Actually, he was just saying it. He didn't mean it that way. However, Yuliancio put the medicine near his lips. First, it touched her palm. Then, it was the extremely bitter medicine that he hated so much. Sheen Amlin instinctively wanted to avoid it, but her palm quickly stuffed the medicine into his mouth. Her action was especially rough. Sheen Amlin glared at her, but she didn't let go. Chapter 1672. Yuliancio laughed and took the water to feed him. However, he pursed his lips tightly and did not feed her the medicine. Yuliancio chuckled. "It's so bitter." She brought the glass closer to him. "Be good and take the medicine." He still ignored her. She immediately understood. She took a sip and crawled to his side. She knelt on her knees and pressed her lips against his. She really could not do that, so she froze there. His dark eyes stared at her for a long time before he reached out and pressed the back of her head to his side. At the same time, he parted her lips and took the water in her mouth. As for her, she also tasted the bitter taste of medicine, and her eyes widened. However, he pushed the medicine in his mouth into hers. Yuliancio was a little confused. She had no choice but to push the medicine back. Both of them shared the medicine. When their lips parted, her eyes were already blurred. He asked coldly, "Have you learned it?" "What?" She looked at him, puzzled. She was still kneeling on the ground. That fragile state of hers made him want to bully her. However, he was powerless even though he wanted to. This was the first time that he felt a sense of heroism in his heart, but he was powerless to do anything about it. He hated her in his heart, so he turned his face away and ignored her. Lianxiu looked at him. She felt annoyed and amused at the same time. Why was he behaving like a child? She did not say a word and just looked at him. Qin Amlin pursed his lips and said impatiently, "Kiss." She thought for a long time before she understood. Kissing. Didn't she know how to do it in the past? Qin Amlin stared at her and said indifferently, "You know it now?" He wanted her to please him. Men who were sick were so difficult to deal with. However, Lianxiu was willing to satisfy him at this moment. Hence, she moved her lips and kissed him gently. He did not move at all. At most, he moved his lips to make it easier for her to kiss him deeply. For the first time, she took the initiative and completed the French kiss. It was a strange feeling as she pressed his shoulder and did that to him, as if she were forcing him. At this moment, he was sick. His eyelids were drooping and his long eyelashes were drooping. Unexpectedly, there was a feeling of weakness. She withdrew and looked at him with watery eyes. She asked softly, "Is this enough?" "Not enough." His tone was still indifferent, but she felt a little awkward and stuffy. Lianxiu smiled and kissed his forehead, coaxing him, "It's contagious." As soon as she said that, he pressed her down and kissed her roughly. The kiss was so thorough that it ignited the fire in his body. Lianxiu clasped his shoulder. She wanted to stop him, but she couldn't. But just as they were about to explode, he let go of her with a slightly uncomfortable expression. She was sitting in his arms, and her eyes were in a daze. It was only when she came back to her senses that she noticed his condition. Lianxiu leaned on his shoulder and couldn't help but giggle. "Enlin, it's okay. Actually, I don't really want to." She laughed softly and whispered into his ear. It sounded like she was comforting him, but it was actually teasing him. Qin Amlin grabbed her long hair and kissed her indiscriminately. He really had no energy left. He lay heavily on the bed and looked at the ceiling. "Lianxiu, if you dare to laugh again, I promise I'll kill you later." Chapter 1673. He turned his head and glared at her. Although he was fierce, she saw warmth in his eyes. She smiled and kissed his tall nose. "Are you hungry?" He glanced at her. "I'm going to cook." She got out of bed and went to wash herself. She even threw him a phone to relieve his boredom. After she left, Qin Amlin lay down and looked in the direction of the door. He knew that he had indulged her a little too much. He knew her intentions, but he had indulged her again and again. He was greedy for every minute and second with her. Even if he would hate her when he turned around, when she smiled at him, when she kissed him and coaxed him, he would feel that she loved him. She still had him in her heart. Qin Amlin lifted the quilt and put on his pajamas. He was a little dizzy, but he felt much better. She walked to the kitchen. She tied her hair into a ponytail and cooked in front of the kitchen counter. The soft sunlight poured in from the window and shone on the side of her face. It was so clear that he could see every pore on her face. Her skin was fair, and after being covered with a layer of soft light, she looked gentler, just like a little wife who cooked for her husband. Qin Amlin leaned against the door and looked at it for a while before asking softly, "How much longer?" She nodded and smiled. "Half an hour will be enough." His eyes were burning. How much longer do you have to leave?" The vegetables in her hand fell to the ground. She was shocked and slowly bent down to pick them up. She rinsed them under the tap and began to cut them again. Halfway through, she stopped and said softly, "I'll leave after cooking." His eyes were full of exploration. He looked at her and smiled mockingly. "Aren't you going to stay and continue to charm me? Or should I say, seduce me, Mr. Yi?" Lianxiu cut the vegetables much faster. Her voice was fast, as if she didn't want to hear what he said. But it was too fast, and her fingers accidentally cut. She was a little lost in thought. She looked at the bloodstain without saying anything and continued to cut. She cooked the dishes mechanically. He kept saying something, but she chose not to listen. Finally, her dishes and a soup were ready. The dishes were still so well cooked, and the two of them were still the same. But it was different. She untied her apron, looked up and smiled bitterly. I'm leaving first. He sat in front of the dining table without making a sound. She understood the conflict in his heart. Love and hate were often separated by a thin line. She understood that it was not his fault, but she still had to do what she had to do, even if he hated her more. She walked past him and was about to head to the bedroom to change her clothes when he grabbed her hand. Eat with me before you leave. But when he squeezed, she cried out softly, "It hurts." He loosened his grip a little and clasped her fingers. Looking at the wound on her finger, his face turned livid. "Why didn't you tell me that you were injured? It's just a small injury. It's nothing," she said lightly. Under his intense gaze, she turned her face away uncomfortably. But he was obviously angry. "Is that so? If you don't need to say it, then what do you need to say?" Raising her hand, he said, "Yi Liangxiu, tell me." He tightened his grip slightly, and she let out a soft cry. But she couldn't stop him. It was only when her finger started bleeding again that he realized how rough he was. He changed his grip to a gentle one, and his expression was also uncomfortable. "Let me help you bandage it." Semi-compulsively, he took her to the bedroom, got the medical kit, and let her sit on his lap. Chapter 1674. He turned his head sideways and said softly, "I'll definitely kill you." She chuckled softly and said, "I'll be waiting." Qin Amlin's gaze deepened, and he looked at her deeply. After a long while, he pulled her over and touched the place where he had touched her. "Are you sure?" Her breathing was a little erratic, and her eyes were sparkling. Qin Amlin glared at her and retracted his hand. He lay down and calmed down for a while. "Let's go eat." "My hand is hurt," she said softly and looked up at him. His gaze was even more unfriendly as he said angrily, "I'll feed you." He sat up, and she sat on top of him with her arm hanging around his neck. Her intention was obvious. Qin Amlin glared at her. "Yi Liangxiu, it's just a finger injury." But she had let an overly indulgent man serve her. But she refused to come down. She buried her face in his neck and nibbled on him like a kitten. His life was about to be taken away by her. "It hurts too." Finally, she pressed herself against his hot neck and looked up at him, her voice low and husky. At this moment, her long hair was scattered hopelessly on the white bathrobe. Coupled with her innocent and fragile expression, she looked like she was in her early 20s again, which made him want to kill her. However, he would probably die before he killed her. Qin Amlin gripped her waist, his dark eyes flashing with the light of wanting to devour her. His voice was unbelievably husky. "Behave." She must have seen his sorry state as she lay there and laughed. It was as though they had returned to the past. Both of them were startled, and their expressions were a little thought-provoking. After a long while, he got up and carried her to the dining room. So what if he doted on her once? She was also silent. Perhaps she had realized that this kind of doting might not happen again in the future, so the atmosphere was a little subtle and uncomfortable. Yi Liangxiu sat down, and he took some food for her. Seeing that she was not eating, he asked lightly, "Do you really want me to feed you?" She lowered her head. "No need." Her voice was a little gloomy. However, he calmly ate his meal. "Unhappy? Do you still care?" She was the same as him, indifferent. This time, he didn't answer. They all knew the reason why he didn't answer, and there was no need to say it. His illness was not completely cured, but there was no reason for him to continue to stay. As time went on, it became cruel. When he left, he was dressed neatly, hiding his sickly appearance. He looked at her seriously. "Let's make an appointment to have a meal together during the new year." She nodded, and they walked out together. Just as he expected, the newspaper reported that he and Yi Liangxiu had spent the night together. This time, there was even a vague report from the receptionist, such as 2 big boxes of books, trauma medicine. After reading the newspaper, Qin Amlin tossed it aside and looked up at Keim. "Where's the PR department? Why aren't you doing anything?" Keim hesitated. "They think that President Qin doesn't care." Qin Amlin pursed his thin lips as if he was about to lose his temper. But in the end, he just leaned against the back of the chair and said nothing. Keim knew that this was President Qin's compromise. In fact, when facing Mr. Yi, President Qin had really compromised time and time again. Mr. Yi was too ruthless. While Qin Amlin was fuming, Yi Liangxiu was in the recording center of ATV. Chapter 1675. Yi Liangxiu and Linda watched from the side stage. Linda's tone was full of surprise. Mr. Yi, why do you think Li Qi has changed so much? I heard that she secretly contacted Mango TV a few times, but she's been behaving herself lately. Yi Liangxiu looked at Li Qi, the host, and smiled. Do you think she's stupid? She's always been a mainstay at ATV. Now that she's at Mango TV, what do you think she'll rank with her qualifications? Linda immediately buttered her up. That's because she sees hope and feels that ATV has a chance to shine again. Yi Liangxiu nodded. Keep an eye out for any good ones, Linda understood. Yeah, we need to train more people. Otherwise, it'll be difficult when the contract expires. It's good that you understand. Yi Liangxiu slowly sat down. In this Vanity Fair, there were no true feelings between companies and artists, only benefits. She wanted artists to rely on the company and not let the company be led by the nose by artists. That would be sad. Linda nodded and then said softly, It's Ran. At the same time, the audience was in an uproar. The female fans were all excited, shouting Ran's name, holding up signs, and crying in excitement. As for Xiao Mian, who was dancing for Ran, in all fairness, her style was very beautiful, but Ran's aura was too strong. Beside Ran, Xiao Mian didn't feel like she existed at all. She was so weak that no one even noticed that Ran's dance partner was the popular female star, Xiao Mian. This made Xiao Mian feel lucky and angry at the same time. Backstage, she kept throwing a tantrum. The little assistant comforted her for a long time, but to no avail. Later, it was a phone call from Che Taixian that made Xiao Mian feel better. When she left, the little assistant stopped her and said hesitantly, Isn't it too risky? If someone finds out, it'll damage our image. Xiao Mian sneered. This kind of thing happens too often in this industry. As long as you don't say anything, who will know? She knew very well that King Entertainment seemed to be supporting her, but they had positioned her as a domestic female star. If she wanted to go abroad, she had to work with a king like Ran. Che Taixian was the only person who could help her, so how could she bear to let him go? Without hesitation, Xiao Mian left with her bag and threw herself into the arms of Che Taehyun, a Korean. She did everything she could to please the middle-aged man. Che Taehyun promised to give her a supporting role in a blockbuster. The male lead was not Ran, but he was still a heavenly king. Xiao Mian was very satisfied. She had served him wholeheartedly that night. Then, she realized that the only way out was to take advantage of him. Xiao Mian left with red marks all over her body. 5 minutes later, Yi Liangxiu was standing at the door. She pushed the door open and entered. In the decadent bedroom, there was a choking smell of love jade that lingered for a long time. Slowly walking in, Che Taixian's expression was a little flustered. He hurriedly tied his bathrobe and laughed dryly. Mr. Yi, a pure Beijing accent wasn't something that Koreans could learn. Yi Liangxiu smiled faintly and looked at him. Are you satisfied? She sat down on the sofa. Che Taehyun immediately followed her and poured her a cup of tea. Satisfied? It's been a long time since I've had such a fresh taste in Korea. Chapter 1676. Che Taixian understood and smiled. I can't accept Miss Ye's money. If Miss Ye hadn't recommended me to Ran back then, I wouldn't be where I am today. With that, he pushed the check back. Since he didn't want it, Yi Liangxiu didn't refuse and took it back. Che Taixian thought for a moment and continued. After all these years, no one can remember the song Ran from back then. Miss Ye has been my benefactor for the rest of my life. Yi Liangxiu was very polite. You did a good job. That's why you have a place in Korea. Che Taixian, or Song Run, had a scandal in the entertainment industry and couldn't go on. However, he was a very good agent and a friend of Jie. Xiao Mian had no way of knowing this. It just so happened that Ran needed an agent at that time. Song Ran knew Korean and had connections in Korea, so Yi Liangxiu recommended him. In the blink of an eye, almost 10 years had passed. That time was after Yi Liangxiu's famous film, Late Autumn. Che Tai-hsien and Yi Liangxiu both recalled the past and couldn't help but sigh. Mr. Yi, what a coincidence. This time, the film is the Korean version of Late Autumn, and Xiao Mian wants to compete with Miss Yi. No wonder she doesn't mind being the second female lead. Yi Liangxiu smiled carelessly, then raised her head slightly. That time, I was also the second female lead. Che Tai-hsien still remembered the scene back then. Yi Liangxiu had filmed an intense scene, but she couldn't do it well. Later, Qin Anlin had to take her away, and after that, things were different. Time had passed, and people in B City had long forgotten what he looked like. He grew a mustache and became Che Tai-hsien, while Yi Liangxiu became Mr. Yi and Qin Anlin. Che Tai-hsien sighed. As long as Mr. Yi needs my help, I will do it. Then he said in a low voice, Don't worry, Mr. Yi. I won't do stupid things for women anymore. What's a woman? Wealth in my hands is real. Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips and said nothing more. That night, Che Tai-hsien sat for half the night. He thought of the woman in the past. The woman who betrayed her husband and betrayed him. He thought that the woman would give up everything for him and go with him. However, after the matter was exposed, she insisted that he was the one who seduced her and even wanted to sue him. After fleeing to South Korea in a sorry state, women were nothing more than playthings to him, especially women like Xiao Mian. When Yi Liangxiu went out, she was holding a disc in her hand, which was given to her by Che Tai-hsien. The exciting video of him and Xiao Mian, 12 GS. Her eyes were a little deep, just like the night. Her body was exhausted, but her eyes were cold. When she walked out of the hotel, the lanterns had already fallen. In the empty street, she actually felt like she was homeless. At the end of the road, there was a slender figure dressed in black, blending into the night. He stood there leisurely, his posture relaxed, and a faint light from the sky shone on his side, elongating a long shadow. Yi Liangxiu gave up the idea of driving and walked toward the person 50 meters away. The fierce night wind blew, cutting her soft face. The pain was just like that day. The familiar pain, the familiar temperature. By the time she came back to her senses, she had already fallen into his embrace. Her face was buried in his shoulder, rubbing against the material of his coat. Even though they had a few nights of absurdity, it was not as touching as this moment. Chapter 1677. Why are you here? She rested her face on his shoulder and did not dare to move. She was afraid that if she moved or looked at him, it would all be an illusion and he would disappear. His shoulder was cold, but it warmed up after a while. She buried her face in his arms and hugged his neck, refusing to let go. He patted her back and asked with a hoarse voice, How did you know I was looking for you? Yi Liangxiu let go of him and took a step back, looking at him in the dark of the night. Under the streetlights, her skin was almost translucent and her facial features looked fresh. Isn't that so? She smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming as though they contained all the stars in the universe. She turned around as though she wanted to leave. He caught her hand and hugged her from behind. Even though they were wearing thick clothes, it felt exceptionally warm. He lowered his head and buried her face in his neck. His voice was slightly hoarse. Are you cold? With that said, he looked at her car that was parked by the roadside and asked deliberately, Why aren't you driving? Yi Liangxiu looked at her car and suddenly realized that she did not see his car. She looked up and asked, How did you get here? Qin Anlin suddenly grabbed her hand. Let's take the subway. Subway? Him? She looked at him suspiciously while his gaze deepened. As they walked forward, he held her hand and said slowly, Some people even make use of a man to sleep with them. Why can't I take the subway? Yi Liangxiu looked at him sideways and said slowly, But I don't want to take the subway. I want to. He paused and looked at her with a clear gaze. Mr. Yi, let's go for skewers. Skewers? She was shocked once again. In her impression, Qin Anlin was a nocturnal animal, but that was only limited to high-end clubs. For example, drinking in bars, KTV in private rooms, and eating skewers. He had nothing to do with it. What? You can bring the Koreans, but you can't bring me? His tone was displeased, and his eyes were burning. Yi Liangxiu exclaimed, Anlin, Are you jealous? She was dressed in a serious manner, and her expression was too innocent, which made her look very cute. Cheen Amlin glared at her and pulled her into the subway station. Standing at the ticket vending booth, Cheen Amlin crossed his arms and looked at her. You buy it. You're the one who wanted to take the subway. She snorted and ignored him. I don't have change. Cheen Amlin sneered. Do you also throw a tantrum like this when you're with Rand? I saw how well you served him. Cheen Amlin, it's embarrassing to be so jealous. She also sneered. Are you jealous? Why didn't I know about this? He looked at the girls passing by and whispered a few words to them. The good-looking young girl immediately took out 10 yuan from her wallet and gave it to him. She waved her hand and left with her friends, laughing and joking. Cheen Amlin studied for a while more before buying 2 tickets. He tilted his head and looked at her smugly. Yi Liangxiu snorted, Seduction. Thank you, Mr. Yi, for complimenting my appearance. He smiled, his eyes bright and dazzling. His black coat made him look even more handsome. Even in the crowded subway, he was still dazzling. Yi Liangxiu pouted. Shameless. Chapter 1678. When they got there, she stretched out her fair hand. Give it to me. He placed a piece of paper on her palm and smiled. I got this by selling my husband. After saying that, both of them were stunned. Husband. This word seemed to have not been used since they broke up. Saying it now was natural, but it sounded unfamiliar. Yi Liangxiu was the first to come back to her senses. She smiled and took it to go through the security check. He followed behind her, his tall figure looming over her. With the 2 of them in front and 1 at the back, the atmosphere was a little strange. It was like 2 teenagers in their 20s throwing a tantrum, neither of them paying attention to the other. Until the 5th line arrived and he walked in front of her. She was stunned for a moment, and then her hand was held by him. She looked up, only to see his back. It was 10 o'clock at night, and the subway was crowded. After squeezing her way up, she was almost lying on his back. The temperature on the subway was also high, and soon her back was sweating. Cheen Amlin was probably also feeling hot. He took off his jacket and put it on his arm. He slowly held her back with one hand, trying to pull her forward. Yi Liangxiu dodged, and in the end, he pulled a young girl. But her looks were a little breathtaking. The young girl looked at Cheen Amlin's handsome face, and her face flushed red. She was so excited that she was about to faint. Oh my God, he looked exactly like the Prince Charming of her dreams. She was about to faint. Someone pinch her and tell her that this was real and not a dream. In contrast to the girl's beautiful dream, Cheen Amlin's face was livid. His expression was fierce, and he glared at the ugly girl in front of him before turning his head. The culprit actually dared to laugh secretly. Yi Liangxiu. He called her name unhappily, but he forgot that they were on the subway and most of them were young people. They didn't notice the existence of Yi Liangxiu, but now they all looked over. It's Yi Liangxiu. Someone cried out, and the surroundings became even more chaotic. Cheen Amlin was the first to realize it. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. Her face was buried in the crook of his arm. Other than her long hair, he couldn't see her face. There was a commotion in the surroundings. Soon, many people gathered, and each of them had little red hearts in their eyes. Cheen Amlin narrowed his eyes and held Yi Liangxiu tightly in his arms. He didn't know who used their phones to record the video and broadcast it live on WeChat Moments. Cheen Amlin stared coldly at that person. Not only did that person not restrain himself, he was even more arrogant. He even added his own voice over. Heavenly Queen Yi Liangxiu is actually on the same line as us with an unknown man. This is what that man looks like. At the end of the video, it was him, and he even made a victory sign. One person started, and the people around him started to take pictures. Yi Liangxiu's face was buried, so no one got a picture. But from the side of her face, they could tell that it was Yi Liangxiu. On the other hand, Cheen Amlin was thorough in his filming. That night, the news in B City's WeChat Moments was about Yi Liangxiu's tryst with an unknown man. But it was later confirmed that the man was Cheen Amlin. It became even more popular after that, because their relationship was previously dug up by the paparazzi, and there was no telling if it was real or fake. But now, they appeared in such a commoner's place, and hugged each other in such an intimate manner. It could be seen that Qin Amlin loved Yulianxiu very much. Chapter 1679. Qin Amlin hugged her indifferently and didn't answer any questions. He only sent a message to Kaim, asking him to bring some men to protect her at a subway station. After another 10 or so stops, he held Yulianxiu in his arms and walked towards the entrance of the subway. Every step was difficult for him. In the end, he draped his jacket over her shoulders and covered her face. Many crazy fans followed them down the subway, but were stopped by the security guards. Yulianxiu finally heaved a sigh of relief. She took off her jacket and revealed her face so that the fans could see her face clearly. It was indeed Yulianxiu. Screams rang out at the subway entrance. Yulianxiu waved and smiled. Then, she took the initiative to hold Qin Amlin's hand. He lowered his gaze and looked at her. After a while, he said in a low voice, "What do you mean? Maintaining my image." She smiled sweetly at him, looking like a delicate wife. Helpless, he took her hand and walked quickly. Yulianxiu followed behind him and shook the jacket in her hands. "Put on." He turned his head and looked at her. He took it and put on slowly. Up ahead was the place where she had entertained Ran. It was a famous place for skewers. Qin Amlin pulled her over to find a stall to sit down. The night breeze, mixed with the smoke from the barbecue, was very choking. He had just been sick, but he was sitting at the vent to block the wind for her. After a while, he was choking nonstop. His hand was covering his mouth, and his nose was red. He looked a little pathetic. Yulianxiu turned her head and grabbed a ball of tissue for him. She said disdainfully, "Stubborn and funny, but very cute," she thought silently in her heart. Qin Amlin looked at her. After a long while, he snorted softly. "Is that so? If you didn't have a wild man, why would I be so calculated with you?" Yulianxiu was a little confused. What did he mean by a wild man? "We slept in the same room when we were drunk. Do you dare to say that there was nothing between us?" His fingers were slightly cold as he pinched her chin with 2 fingers. His expression didn't look too good. Yulianxiu looked at him in surprise and didn't know what to say. Was this considered settling scores after the fall? At that time, he didn't have such a huge reaction. Qin Amlin tightened his grip. Now, he was giving her a chance to prove herself. Only now did she realize that he wasn't jealous. He was here to settle scores and wanted her to give him an explanation. After that incident, he had slept with her, yet he was still able to endure until now to settle the score with her. He must be able to endure it. Yulianxiu snorted and glared at him. "Qin Amlin, don't go too far. You're the one who crossed the line." He leaned close to her, his breath scorching the streets in the middle of the night. "Tell me, have you ever kissed her?" He knew very well what it was like to be drunk. He didn't want to think about it, didn't want to pursue it, but he couldn't let it go. This was probably a man's deep-rooted bad habit. Yulianxiu stared at him for a long time before she pursed her lips. After a long while, she said softly, "No." "Really?" His gaze was sharp and focused on her face, not letting go of any expression on her face. At this moment, he looked like he was interrogating a criminal. Yulianxiu's gaze landed on his face. After a while, she suddenly laughed. "It's fake." He tightened his grip and she cried out in pain. "Ouch!" But he didn't let her off. His thin lips were tightly pursed. Yulianxiu couldn't stand the pain and placed her hand on the back of his hand. "I'm lying, I didn't." Chapter 1680. Qin Amlin narrowed his eyes as he looked at her. He grabbed her hand and finally let go of her. At this moment, the boss brought the menu over. "Sir and Miss, please order your meal." Coincidentally, this stall was owned by the same boss as the one who came to Ran the previous time. He had a deep impression of Yulianxiu. Not every 172 kilograms girl could be so good-looking. The most important thing was to have a good temperament. The boss smiled and took the menu. "Miss, there's a different mister today." Yulianxiu pursed her lips and looked at Qin Amlin cautiously. Qin Amlin glared at her and then calmly ordered his meal. Without looking up, he said to the boss, "There's always been only one, the one from a few days ago." He sneered. He doesn't like women. The boss was stunned. If he didn't like women, then he liked men, but it didn't seem like it. He looked so mighty and cool. But even if he liked men, he would definitely be number one and definitely not number zero. With that thought, the boss felt a little better. After Cheen Amlin finished ordering, he passed the menu to the boss and added 2 more bottles of beer. The boss smiled. It'll be ready in a minute. After the boss left, Yi Lianxiu looked at him. Aren't you sick? Why are you drinking beer? Did you drink when you were with Ran the other day? His voice was indifferent. Yi Lianxiu didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How can I compete with him? Are you saying that I can't compete with him? He said childishly. Yi Lianxiu deliberately made him angry. Yeah, you can't compete with him. Her gaze swept over to him. He understood. She had thought that he would be angry, but he didn't. He only glanced at her lightly and smiled. You'll know tonight whether you can compete with him or not. The boss brought the beer over. Ao opened the bottle and poured it for her, as if he was serving Empress Dowager Cixi. Yi Lianxiu took a sip and laughed. You're so sick. Behave yourself. He didn't say anything and took a sip of wine. Then, his gaze fell on the wine in front of him. After a long time, he asked softly, Yi Lianxiu, do you think you can do whatever you want now that we're not together? She stared blankly for a moment before saying softly, No, never. Cheen Amlin glanced at her and didn't say anything. He just drank quietly. She wanted to persuade him not to drink, but in the end, she didn't say anything. Instead, she finished her bottle, then took his. Cheen Amlin held the cup, and his eyes were deep. Yi Lianxiu, what is this? His fingers tightened, gripping her, and she hurt. The specks of starlight from the roadside shone into her eyes, as if flowing water had flowed past her eyes. After a long time, Yi Lianxiu pursed her lips. Amlin, no matter what happens between us, I hope you'll be well. He laughed coldly. Can I be well? She looked down and didn't say anything. She looked aggrieved. He was a little annoyed and wanted to vent his anger, but he held it in. He pushed all the skewers in front of her and said stiffly, Eat. There was a lot of it. Yi Lianxiu looked at it and felt a little jealous, but she still ate quietly. He watched her eat. His mood was probably a little better because of her obedient look. He made an exception and peeled the prawns for her, but his voice was still tough. You're eating so fast. Aren't you afraid of swallowing? You're so dumb. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.